So I just had a debate with a friend on what do you think would have been the best time in history to be born? Today, in my generation, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 40s, what would have been the best time so that you would have the happiest life? And I've come to the conclusion that somewhere in the late 1940s, early 1950s would have been the sweet spot, right? Because you got to think about it. Feminism really wasn't a big thing, right? And let's say you were born in 1950. You're a teenager in the early 70s. The 70s were great. And, and your mom was still your mom, and your dad was still the guy who brought home the bacon. And women were still women, and men were still men. That's kind of a big thing. So we kicked around a lot of ideas. And it wasn't so much which was the best generation to have the most fun, right? Because let's say if you were born in the late 70s, you grew up during the 80s. The 80s were great. I mean, we had video games. On the ass end of it, we had the invention of the internet, the invention of the cell phone. I mean, I'm sure it was invented before that, but it was mainstream in the early 90s. We had MTV, we had rock music, we had everything, Nintendo, Cabbage Patch Kids. It was great, right? But then in the 90s, going into the 2000s, things kind of jumped off the rails. And then look at what happened today, right? And now we're in our 30s and 40s. Some of us are in early 50s. And it's just not fun. You could say if you were born in the 70s, you missed the oil embargo, Iranian crisis of the end of the 70s, early 80s, and the high inflation, and the savings and loan crisis that happened in the end of the 80s, and the banking crisis, and the Gulf War that happened in 91. You were only 10, 11 years old, You weren't that old really for it to matter. But if I had a choice, I would say like 1948, right? The year that the Tucker automobile was made would have been the year. Because you're just a young kid in the 50s, mom and dad are in the house, color TV becomes a thing a little while later. You got to watch the man set foot on the moon, 1969, Neil Armstrong. I mean, yeah, you had the Vietnam War in that time frame, but that would have been the sweet spot. Because those people are in their 80s now, and as the world is crashing down around us, they're not really fazed by it, because they're going to be, they're at the end of life at this point. They're just like, well, it sucks to be my grandkids, but it is what it is, right? So that's the thought process we're having today. What would have been the best generation to be born in? And my vote would have been in the late 40s. You missed the Great Depression by a couple decades. The world got stabilized. You missed the beginning of the one war. I'm just saying, that would have been the sweet spot. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I'm kind of curious. And subscribe if you're interested in my weird thought processes, because I have a lot of them.